Hello again, and welcome to our next outing in the world of thinking differently. And I am very happy today to welcome a friend of old, James Bradburne. James, I will introduce very briefly because I could go on a little bit here. Trust me. James is a museologist, architect, designer, children's author, educator, not least connected to the Fondazione Regio Children, early years learning in different environments, making learning visible, and much more. I first met James when he was the director of the Palazzo Strozzi in Florence, and I was in charge of the Children's University, which had just started. And James was a tremendous help and became a friend of the organization as well as mine. He spent the last 8 years or so at the Pinacoteca di Brera in Milan, where he's also developed, and I'm really interested in this, the Brera Plus. And this is it's about participants as stakeholders in the organization's future. And when you look up James, what you come across are two concepts. One is change for good, and the other one is people. And those two combined make looking at his work really quite different. James, I can't tell you how happy I am that you're here with us today, my friend. And if I may, James, just to start, the question really, who is James Bradburne and how did James Bradburne become the James Bradburne of today?
Oh, you always ask these easy questions. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure. It was a pleasure working together, and it's a pleasure seeing you and talking to you again. That is a difficult question, but the answer, if you want it in short, is I spent a good part of my early life trying to be a very beautiful flower. I did beautiful things. I was a designer. I designed spaces. I designed experiences. And at a certain point, I decided that it was more important to be a gardener. So most people, when they ask what I do, I just say, well, I'm the gardener at Brera. My job is to find places people grow best in and to encourage them to grow. And anyone who's worked in a large organization, especially now, as I have been in a state museum, encumbered by bureaucracy and administration, et cetera, will know how many times great ideas and great thoughts and great projects get stopped by somebody who's a little scared or doesn't, well, we don't have the budget for that, or, oh, well, we couldn't do that, or somebody might think this. There is a legion of people who say no. I'm really quite allergic to no, so I consider myself a gardener. Now, I know you want to ask me, because I know the questions you have in your mind, you have shared them, you want to ask me, and what am I doing to make a difference? Now, that's another thing, and it's difficult to not sound pretentious, because, well, we all make a difference if we do things in the right way. But most recently, what I can say is after 8 years, I've taken a museum and a national library, two national Italian state institutions, and transformed them in a way that has given them back to the community. The state had expected of its museums primarily to conserve the artworks that were held there. They didn't really give much thought to who came to see them. Their goal, and their explicit goal, was just take care of the works. It's the world's heritage, which it is. But what it created was an internal culture that had its back to the public. And so when I started, after 3 months of listening, which, by the way, is one of the keys to the whole thing, is listen. Two keywords are respect and listening. So after 100 days of listening to taxi drivers, to concierge, to cleaning ladies, to, all sorts of people, I detected in Milan this sort of sadness about they all love Brera. Oh, yes, I used to go when I was a child, or yes, my grandfather used to, but it had become a symbol of shabbiness, of union problems, of conflicts between the institutions that are in the Palace of Brera. And so after 100 days, I said, look, our mission is twofold. This is obviously done in conjunction with the key staff as well. I said, we're going to give Brera back to the city. We're going to put Brera back in the heart of Milan, and we're going to put the user back in the heart of Brera. Easy peasy. That was the goal. And after 8 years, I think that I can say that that mission has been largely accomplished. The most remarkable thing is a project which was developed during COVID, when we finally could break the horrible chain that bound us to numbers and visitor numbers and tourism, by pointing out the fact that museums didn't become less good because they had zero visitors. Remember that the measure of museums has always been, well, it's a good museum because a lot of people go there. You say, yes and no. So we finally, during COVID, and that's not to in any way diminish the awful aspect of COVID and the deaths and the psychological trauma that countries, especially Italy perhaps, felt, we managed to push the whole notion of the institution just beyond any boundaries that we'd known. We are now the only museum in Italy, if not the world, that has no tickets and has no visitors, because we have basically turned the museum into a subscriber-based museum instead of a visitor-based museum. You are no longer purchasing with your 15 euros the right to go into a space between 8:30 in the morning and 7:30 at night. You are purchasing basically a share. Imagine it as a cooperative or something. You become a shareholder, a stakeholder, and that tessera, that card, allows you 3 months free entry and a year's entry to an exceptional online site that attempts to answer the question, what is it that you can't see when you come? So rather than doing what nearly every other museum I know did during COVID, which is try to illustrate what you could see when you could come back. So you had all these marvelous videos of curators in their pajamas running around showing you paintings and things like that. We started to say, what can we do here that you couldn't do when you come to the museum? What could you do? You know, when you come to the museum, you want to go look at paintings, and then that's what you should do, and you can't really substitute that. So we started giving access to the storage spaces. We gave high-resolution images in which people who were looking at the image simultaneously could start a chat, whether they were in Singapore or in Milan. We created documentaries that you could stop at any point and go explore different elements of the material. We had live stream concerts where you could stop, preferably at the end of a movement, and go to talk to the musicians. I mean, we had an extraordinary explosion of creativity trying to answer what is it that we can provide online that complements the museum, that gives us the right to say we are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for which it becomes legitimate to offer a subscription. So a piece of what we do. Effectively, what we did was we transformed the museum as a noun into a museum as a verb. And this transformation, I think, if you say, what did we do to make the difference? This proposal of how a museum could work, which includes the right to participate once a year in a board meeting where the director presents to the board the next 3-year plan, is really quite revolutionary. This transformation, which is not a physical transformation, I can go on at length about the physical things we did and about the ways in which we opened up the museum, having Christian paintings labeled by rabbis and imams and priests. I mean, we've done lots of cool stuff physically, but the most important thing I think we did was this massive conceptual transformation. But I think in 10 years, there won't be a museum in the world that isn't as subscription-based museum. I think it is it is the way that our cultural institutions have to move in order to take them out of the vicious circle of being handmaidens of a tourism that's destroying the planet.
A few observations there. Across the media world, many of our viewers are from there. Much of what you've just touched on is around that issue of thinking differently, and I think applies to the media world, as indeed do those things about what we do. Is it top down, or is it user focused? And indeed, I think the numbers game that you alluded to, of course, applies. At the same time, your connection to the Fondazione Regio Children, then that leads kind of to two questions, I suppose. One is, how did all of that influence your work in terms of museums? But also, I think very importantly, that bit around, so what's missing in the education system that needs to be put right?
One of the, I first was introduced to the Regio system. I first encountered it in 1986, actually, in Vancouver. I was working as a young designer in an architectural practice, and they had their traveling show, the 100 Languages of Children, which was touring the world. And so I had known about Regio for some time, but when I really got to know them, it was in 1999, and I was running my first museum, the Museum of Applied Arts in Frankfurt. And as you say, every time I tackled a new institutional challenge, whether it be the Science Center in Amsterdam, whether it be Frankfurt, the first reaction is horror. How do you break these walls down? How do you somehow approach it differently? Not for yourself, although that's always a plus, but mostly for the users. So when I actually at the museum in Frankfurt, I was invited to be part of a board organized by Lego. And on the advisory board with me was Carlina Rinaldi. Now, Carlina Rinaldi is a visionary in her own right, but she was also the bridge between the real drivers of the Regio approach. So we're talking Loris Malaguzzi was probably the most important, Gianni Rodari, the Italian children's writer, communist resistance fighter. I mean, we're talking here is a system that is born out of a local experience, which is the city of Regio Emilia. It's a small city of about 150,000 people, but with a very radical tradition also. I mean, you have to imagine that here again, circumstance gives you Regio Emilia. The Regio Emilia approach is not like Montessori. It's not an educational approach. It is the way they do things in Regio, and it's the way they do those things is because Regio has a history. During the war, the Second War, it was the absolute heartland of the armed resistance against Nazism. After the war, it was in ferment because there was a tension even after the war in Italy between very top-down forces of the right-wing Catholic education system, very Jesuit-oriented, very top-down, and the bottom-up, and the Regio schools, of which there are 29, particularly the preschools, so the asili and nidi, so 0 to 6, starting with, the Union of Italian Women, the UDI, the Unione delle Donne Italiane, a communist organization, gave birth to this, or took over the municipal school system. Their enlightened director, Loris Malaguzzi, was a gifted educator, and he formulated this idea of the 100 languages of children. He says, it's not just reading and writing. Children don't have just a single language. And coming to what you were saying, and one of the key insights of Loris Malaguzzi, which I use in my own work all the time, is the goal of education isn't the content of education, it's creating the conditions. What they do when you enter one of these preschools, you get your kid in at 18 months old or 2 years old, and they don't read, but then they find themselves with 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, right? This is normal. The first thing every child gets when they enter a Regio school is a postbox. very simple postbox. And what they soon figure out, 2-year-olds being absolutely perfectly autonomous human beings, very bright, they notice that their peers are doing things. They're sending messages to each other. And now these messages can be sticky notes, they can be flowers, they can be symbolic, but they also, at a certain point, come to see that there's something else going on. And by the time that kids in a Regio system are 3, more or less, they go to their teachers and demand the right to master this system that we call reading and writing. So rather than teaching, they don't teach reading and writing in Regio. I mean, this is one of the most extraordinary things. They create the conditions whereby reading and writing becomes an internal drive. And you have kids who are reading and writing at least 1.5 years before generally you even get taught. And they do it with joy because they want to have this way of talking to their friends in more than, flower petals. So they want these things called letters, and they want to know how they work, damn it, and they want to send messages. This is at the heart of both my own background, my own beliefs, and in Regio, I found this system that was very sensitive to the child at the center, but not the child as they say there, not as a pre-anything, not as a stage before. These children are autonomous human beings with the limits that you have of having 3 years experience. Regio respects the autonomous child, and the system functions along 2 basic axes. One is ascolto, listening. The way a Regio school works is the teachers don't really teach. What they do is they transcribe conversations among children, and making those discussions visible, so the second part is documentation. So they transcribe, they render these discussions visible, and then they recursively feed them back into later discussions. Oh, this week you tried to draw yourselves in a circle. It was really hard, wasn't it? You can't get the people overlapping. Well, here's what you did last week. How could we make that better? I mean, you get these recursive reintroductions of documentation. Documentations become fundamentally public places whereby people meet across their differences. It is a profound approach to learning that is not a system, and it's not a recipe. It is a sensibility and a respect. That's the third word that's fundamental. Listening, respect, documentation. That characterizes what makes Regio such a special place. And now you go to Regio, you find people who grew up in those schools, and it's a different kind of city. Regio is an extraordinary place. And in fact, I've just 2 years ago set up myself a small foundation, an association for studies in the culture of childhood, and I've based it in Regio. The center is now based in Regio, where I find myself quite often. I just opened an exhibition I just curated on avant-garde puppets in Regio. So you can do things in Regio that you can't do anywhere else.
So if I take that piece of education and how that's influenced you in terms of the work that you do as you say, on a daily basis, how do you see could that also should it influence the media world, so that it isn't just the production, producing a product, but that it works more bottom up, more engaged, more participant focused?
Well, let me make a bridge here, because what I'd like to do is make a bridge between the Regio experience, which, as I said, for me was extremely powerful. It wasn't just me falling in love with Regio, but happily they also saw in me someone whose passion was how people learn outside of the school. So the bridge was then, how could I imagine a museum environment, let's say, or a library environment for that matter, but particularly museums, which are characterized by non-continuity. You go once a year, you might go see an exhibition. If you leave something, it'll be cleaned up and thrown in the bin. I mean, there are characteristics about museums that are completely the opposite of the Regio school approach. So my question to myself, and this is something that I fully came to grips with at the latter part of my 4 years in Frankfurt, and then when I began my work in Palazzo Strozzi, is how can we create a culture of respect, listening, and traces? How can we allow the passage of users through, or visitors, if you wish, through a museum space? How can you let that recursively inform the next visitor? Because that's something that's notoriously not the case in museums. Notoriously, you go to an exhibition, you open it. I mean, we love openings. We go there, we drink champagne, and it's all clean and pretty. Well, 3 months later, you take it down. It's actually the same exhibition. What's happened? Well, it's the same exhibition. Nothing's changed in it. So it's a huge challenge, I think, as I grew. Also, you have to see this as a temporal thing in my own career. As I became more and more involved in the management and decisions about how you created museum environments, the more I was asking myself, how could you import what really was working in a Regio system into my world, into the world of visitors who came for 2 hours every 3 months at the best of times, and possibly in 3 years in other times. And so I started to work on a strategy very much based also linguistically, that I titled it Visible Learning. How do you have a strategy of visible learning in a museum? How can you not just listen to people? That's just marketing. Everybody does that. Everybody does surveys. We all listen to people. The key is, how do you show people you've listened to them, and how do you allow them to leave things for other people to listen to? We're always looking for new ways of trapping visitors' comments, but not just comments, but experiences, and leaving them there as a means of enhancing and fueling successive visitors' experiences. At Palazzo Strozzi, this could take the form of the opportunity to draw, to leave your drawings. We had a radio studio in one exhibition where children could interview their grandparents, and it became an archive, an oral history of childhood. And then we created a Monopoly game whereby families could use the roll of a dice to select objects to sit down and talk about and do things around. And when they landed on the corner, given it was the 1930s and it is fascism, we decided not to have a go to jail car. We said, go to the radio studio. So then people would go to the radio studio, and the child would interview the older person about their childhood. So after 3 months, you can imagine the richness of material we had that was recursive, that you could then make available to other people. They could comment on that. So this idea of constantly making this listening visible. It wasn't so much making learning visible, because you couldn't say anything about the state of the learning going on. But what you could do was you could say, we're making people things that were invisible visible, the listening. And this was done with enormous respect, because it wasn't a blog, though. I mean, although a lot of my work was done before social media, it wasn't anything goes. And that's an interesting principle, by the way, that comes up when you're working in a public setting, is you have to create experiences which don't create too much noise. Generally, noise occurs when the activity that you're proposing is more boring than being a hooligan. In Amsterdam, for instance, we had a marvelous section on psychology, and we had this is 1997, okay, so we're way back, prehistory at technological, but very media-based. It was a section on human psychology, and we had the opportunity that you could record a video recording of yourself. I mean, it's effectively, now you can do it on any cell phone, but that's this point, this was a big deal. So you'd sit in a booth, and you and your friend could record something. Now, in the first 2 weeks, what we did, because one of the other things I insist on is we work like anthropologists. That's the other strain in my life, is anthropology. You watch people and you see what they do and you work with that. You don't try to create situations where they do what you want them to. You actually take what they want to do. So we found these teenagers would come in, and of course they would say bad words, or they would essentially behave badly to camera because, wow, I can do this to camera. So we kept changing it and changing. We had a cardboard prototype. It was just in the prototyping phase. And we found that if we asked them, what does love mean to you? Suddenly the noise levels went down, because the question was actually more important to answer than it was to create, to use swear words. So the same thing has occurred in Brera. I mean, fast forward 20 years, we have drawing benches in the rooms, and it's just pencil, paper, and a bench. Doesn't even, I think it might say, no, it doesn't even say draw. It just is there. And you would expect that people would, Juve is merde, whatever, you would expect a high level of noise. But because they're there, placed usually in front of a masterpiece, a picture, we have an almost invisible level of noise. And we have 6,000 or 7,000 excellent drawings. People will sit for hours, and they'll sit as a group or as a couple, or you'll have a kid and their grandfather, and they will draw. The offer to draw is so much more interesting than the offer to create chaos. And that's very Regio, is that you have to work with the structuring in order to confine. So the bridge I'm making, I'm going to get to media at some point, but the bridge I'm making is from the Regio approach, which for me was an already in operation working prototype of things I believed about not only my own learning patterns, but those I believed were latent in more people than we think. I think we tend not to respect learners. I think there's a lot of fear and a lot of worry in top-down education because we actually don't trust people to learn on their own, right? I think it's a lot about trust. And so learning that in Regio, if you trusted a 3-year-old, they asked you how to read. I mean, that's pretty cool. And taking that to a museum environment, that started to become a real way of creating an environment that unlocked a respect for people that had its impact on the demography. The effect of having labels written by Muslims under a painting out of the Bible is really striking. It's invisible, you don't hear, but you see the change in the people. Hey, well, I'm listened to as well. I mean, this idea that the signal of respect was so powerful that I can show it in the demography, that we have more younger Muslim people coming. In Frankfurt, it was even easier in Frankfurt. The labels when I got there were all written in German, small and generally incomprehensible even to Germans. And we had a great Islamic collection. So I redid all the texts in our Department of Islamic Art, which was very good, in Turkish, Arabic, English, and German. And we went from 3,500 Turkish visitors a year to 35,000, for goodness sake. I mean, it was shocking how easy it was to include by respecting.
And I also now, almost linking this to the final question, everything you've just mentioned, I think has consequences for the way that media should think. What, bearing in mind, we could talk for hours here, but what one message out of all of that, what one piece of advice would you give to the traditional, as it were, media world, and say, you need to consider this, you need to look differently at the following?
So when we're speaking of broadcast media, I think what you can do is involve the user with greater respect and more listening as you are making, i.e., you can involve people in the various parts and do exactly what we do in the museum. You listen, you register, you work as an anthropologist. I think that's so. What you come out with, nevertheless, is a final product that is the result of, and I would hope reflects the respect with which people have been listened to. What you were saying, though, triggered a second reflection on another project we have, which is on Brera Plus, which is the way we do documentaries, which is we've taken a traditional broadcast model, which is a 26-minute documentary, which kind of works like a train, right? I mean, every narrative art, the problem with giving a museum experience, which is characterized by user autonomy, right? What makes a museum different than the narrative arts, the time-based arts? In the time-based arts, ballet, theater, cinema, reading a book, you start at A, you go to the end, and the author keeps you still. You are still, and the author moves the frames in front of you. That's what authors do. They're very good at it. But museums, people move, and the narrative stays still, or the content stays still. So it would be as if the art of museum work, my world, is to write an opera that you can start in any place, sing starting in any pitch, move in any direction that still retains coherence. Something comes out of it that's clear and important and can move you, right? Is something happens to you. The possibility to be transformed in a museum has to occur taking into consideration that your child needs to go pee, you want a coffee, you want to see something twice, there are too many people looking at it. So it's totally different. Now, if that is the quality of a museum experience, how do I put that online? This is one of our questions for the COVID brainstorming. How do I not take pictures of people in museum moving around by themselves, which is sort of silly, or show what's in the museum, like the virtual museum, and walk around it, which is very banal? How do I convey the possibility of taking things at my own time, doing them at my own speed, doing them twice, etc.? So we came up with a provisional format of a 26-minute documentary and looked at it as if it were a train ride. In the traditional media, this was a train that went from Milan to Rome in 3 hours and 2 minutes. You knew that after an hour and 26 minutes, you would go by Florence, you could look at the Duomo, but you kept going and you saw out the window your narrative. And what we did is we decided to put in stops so you could get off the train. And when you got off the train, let's say you wanted to get off the train in Florence, you could go have a coffee, you could see a museum, you could go buy a pencil. So in our documentary, there are stops, and at the stops, you can stop and you can go down and you can leaf through original material, you can look at high-res images, you can listen to archival recordings, you can communicate with other people who've left things there in their trip. So you have this way of stopping the train. It also means that unlike a documentary, which you see once and you don't see twice, you can go back to it over and over again. We have documentaries of 26 minutes that have 7 hours of researchable material sitting underneath. So you can go back, you can see it again, you can go to Florence 3 times and not get to Rome. You can then go to the next step. And this kind of Brera Plus documentary became an extremely interesting experimental example of how you could create media that started to incorporate the joy of wandering about that you find in a park or a museum. It's a totally different mode of learning, of discovering things, of being transformed by content that was not dependent on a fixed linear narrative. In fact, it's a strategy that in the museum I call a narrative nonlinear experience. So you're creating an environment that is so rich in connections, and the connections are still constructed. You don't devolve into chaos. It is not just an archive. It's not just a bunch of stuff like a pile of Lego bricks, but nor is it built to the box, nor is it something you have to make like this. It's not constructed for you. It's an environment in which you are lightly constrained in a way that the constraints allow meaning to emerge. And that to me is one of the key principles. And this isn't so much a Regio principle as it is a fundamental principle of looking for systems that, rather than putting variety and coherence on a scale in which the closer you get to coherence, i.e. story, the further you get from variety, which is what I want to do, the way I want to do it, looking for systems that maximize variety and coherence simultaneously, of which there are some very good examples. Games do, language does. I mean, as I said, I haven't invented anything, nor have I invented the subscription. I mean, every newspaper I know is a subscription-based newspaper now, not I mean, what I propose for the museum is merely what was done by the print media 15 years ago. So it's not, I'm not pretending any great step forward on my own hook, but I think museums and informal learning spaces can do a lot by thinking deeply about how they become environments wherein you learn, wherein you support self-initiated and self-sustaining learning.
James Bradburne, Thinking Differently, thank you so much for being with us today, and I hope to see you again very soon.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks a lot, Ger.
Thank you.